Hey, welcome back to the channel. This video a little bit different. It's our highlights video from the stream this week. Been enjoying jumping on live and talking through your questions about endurance, sports science, performance, training, whatever it may be. And we had some great questions come through again this week. Some that came through before the episode went up or before we went live on the channel. From people who couldn't make it, they went over to Instagram, and I'll link it down in the bottom corner down below. Sent me a direct message, asked their question. Couldn't make it to the live, but still wanted to get their thoughts out there and join the conversation. So there's multiple ways you can get involved in the discussion. You don't always have to be there Wednesday, 7 p.m. Melbourne time to be able to ask your questions and get the questions answered. Feel free to contribute over in the down the comment section of a video or over on Instagram. You can go check it out there and get your questions answered. We've got some great ones coming up. Some of the best questions you can look forward to in this video and the highlights package. Talk about glycogen and fueling up for races and leading into races in that sort of last 2 hour window is a really key question we cover this week. Differences in VO2 max between, say, running and cycling. Is there a difference or should there be one? And then also when and how to plan that long run, particularly for marathon runners, really critical, maybe even triathletes as well. How to plan that long run in the week. You might be able to take some of the principles if you're a cyclist or a different endurance athlete and you add that into your long endurance session of the week. So some great ones coming up. Hopefully you enjoy it. Leave your comments and questions down below if you want to continue the discussion from anything we talk about here, or you've got a new question you'd like to bring to the table. Always happy to hear it. Leave them down in the comments below. As always, keep subscribing to the channel. Share this with someone who might be interested. And yeah, enjoy the highlights from this week's stream. Unfortunately, Ben, who sent them through, couldn't join us tonight, so we wanted to send them through in the comments. Left me a note on Instagram as well to let me know. It'd be great to sort of share these. He thought they'd be useful questions, and I definitely think they are. And he had a couple there, but I pulled out two of the ones that I think are really the most important for everyone who might be watching or watching the replay and our community in general, in terms of in and around VO2 max was where he was mainly sort of spending his time. Does VO2 max change across different sports? And it's a really interesting conversation I have with a lot of athletes, whether it's talking about a triathlete who's going between bike and run, for example, is the classic case of does it change? Is it the same? The really simple answer is VO2 max theoretically should be the same across all of your sports from an absolute perspective. You should have a maximal oxygen consumption that you can get to. That generally will only occur, though, if you are completely equally trained in all of those sports. So this is where someone like a triathlete at the elite level, we quite often see that their difference in VO2 max is pretty small. It's very, very minimal, maybe 1 to 2 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute as a relative measure. Only for the fact because they're equally trained. They're able to perform the same relative output in terms of intensity, so therefore it requires the same maximal oxygen consumption. Where it differs mainly for athletes who are across a number of different sports, or an athlete who is lesser trained in one, so typical amateur age group athlete who might be a really good cyclist and moving into triathlon, or the other way around, they're a great runner moving into triathlon, so their cycling is weaker. Whichever way, we typically see the weaker sport is obviously going to be lesser, mainly because they can't output that maximal intensity. And our great examples from some of the athletes I've tested before in the lab, where we see they're a really good endurance runner, and they're getting into triathlon, for example. They jump on the bike, and their bike test, their VO2 max is significantly down. They might be 60 to 65 mils per kilo per minute on the run, and all of a sudden they're sort of 50 to 55 on the bike. And why is this the case? It's because one, it's just a specificity of training. You need to be able to train for what you're needing prepared to do. So they're just not used to being on the bike. Two, particularly in that circumstance, where we go from run to bike, we typically see lower, mainly because we get a lot of localized muscular fatigue. So the legs have to do all of the work I guess outside of what you would see in a running economy side of things, where the running technique and the lift you create by using the arms and swinging the arms can actually help you and be of benefit as well. So all of these things are contributing factors as to why it might be lower. We also have to consider the differences as well. We're going to see pretty different heart rates, pretty different ventilations also. But when we are equally trained, we should see similar differences in terms of upper body sports versus lower body sports. Potentially someone's going to fatigue a lot quicker in something like rowing, swimming, maybe kayaking than they might if they're in cycling or they come from a cycling background. The lower body, obviously bigger muscle groups, so you can produce a lot more power for a long period of time before they fatigue compared to the upper body. But if you're high enough trained, you're probably going to outperform that lower body activity. If you're minimally trained in the legs and you don't do much cycling, and you're doing a bunch of rowing, of course you're going to perform better in the rowing. So there is difference. It can be different across the sports, but it should, in theory, if we were equally trained in everything, which we know not every athlete is, in theory, we should all be the same. That's a very simple breakdown of it. I have done a video that is a bit more comprehensive of the breakdown, particularly between cycling and running, because they're the main two when we talk about triathletes getting involved. But it's really, across all sports, we should see some pretty sort of similar differences. We've got a great question that's come through into the chat here, so I might bring it up on the screen. Going back to old school without heart rate strap or smartwatch training, how does one keep track of training endurance? Do we just go back to time and RPE focus? Interesting question, and this is something I think a lot of athletes have had the opportunity to do over the last little while. I know I've done it at stages, particularly through COVID and lockdowns and things like that, where you've got a number of restrictions on you. So going out and running at your regular pace or running at your regular heart rate may not be practical. A lot of athletes who are stuck in their 5K radius might have to run hills when they may not normally, or ride hills when they may not normally. So all of these things can sort of influence it. When we're talking about then what do we use to monitor our training intensity? How do you keep track? Time and RPE is a really, really good method. I mean, the breakdown in terms of monitoring things like training load, if you look at some of the research of comparing complex methods of analyzing training load, so acute to chronic work to rest ratio, even looking at things like TSS from a Training Peaks perspective, if you're using that software, any type of training stress score, acute stress, chronic stress, anything like that on your software, if you're using Strava, Training Peaks, whatever it may be, RPE multiplied by minutes or time, RPE multiplied by time, ends up giving a very, very comparable metric in terms of training volume. This was something we incorporated into actually one of my projects for my master's degree earlier this year. We're talking about an annual training program for an athlete, and we're actually talking about how we can manage training load. And a really simple and effective way is actually to use RPE and duration, because the match between your perception of intensity and what your physiological output is in terms of if you're using pace or heart rate is going to be pretty good if you're reasonably trained. If you're brand new into a sport, of course you're going to feel like you can run faster than what you can, particularly or ride harder than what you can, particularly early days, until you sort of work out where you are. But once you've got that understanding of what your body can actually do, you have a pretty good idea of what a 10 out of 10 feels like. You have a good idea of what a 7 out of 10 feels like, all of these little ins and outs. So then multiplying it by time is actually a really good way of just monitoring training load and training stress across a training cycle. Things that you might use outside of that, I know a really effective one and I use it a lot on the bike when I'm trying to control some of my intensity, do some zone 2 endurance type stuff, is I just breathe in and out through my nose. That restricts the intensity as well. That's not using any metrics, that's not using any numbers, but I actually find it keeps me within that zone 2 because it's limiting a little bit in terms of what my oxygen supply is. And when I feel like I need to breathe like in through my nose and out through my mouth, I go, okay, I'm probably pushing a little bit hard, but I'm kind of on the edge. When I start breathing in and out through my mouth, I know I'm pushing way too hard for that type of session. So that's also a bit of a guide that I use. It is reasonably good. I've done a little bit of testing in terms of how does that stack up compared to your training zones based on a lab test, etc. When we get changes in things like lactic acid, and we have to go up into the next block of intensity, and as intensity increases, we get changes in lactic accumulation in the system. We need increases in ventilation to combat that and get more oxygen in to sort of combat that increase in lactic acid. So if we're changing how we're breathing, that's a pretty clear sign of that. If we need to breathe through the mouth more, obviously we're going to be trying to get more ventilation, more air in, etc., and dump a bit more CO2 and try and work through that process. So any of those methods, RPE is a really good one. Using time as well is a good one as also, because then you can start to think about, well, if I need to do some interval training, time instead of distance can be a better metric. I need to run at a 9.5 out of 10 for 2 minutes, and then I'm going to have a walking recovery. That you can make it pretty close to what you would be doing if you're looking at stuff. So by all means, if you're going back that old school approach, there's some strategies you can use, and it definitely can work. Glycogen stores typically last about 2 hours of activity. So how much do glycogen stores deplete before the exercise while athletes wait so they don't get a stitch? Follow up to this question here as well. Some people need to wait 30 minutes while others it is 2 hours. I think what you're referring to here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is maybe I guess the simple way we could look at this is before a training session or before a race is probably the big one as well. How long do you need to wait before you get into it? And I think it is a little bit individual. So you're right. Some athletes might only need 30 minutes. I know I can have something to eat within that sort of hour period, not a massive amount. It might be a banana, or it might be a energy bar, like a muesli bar or something that is just going to be short, sharp, give me a good burst of fuel to just keep me going. But also, I've probably had my big meal a couple of hours before that. And that's what I'd probably recommend. If you're going to get into a big race for the day, a big training session, if you're playing a game of sport, whatever it may be, 2 or so hours before, get that big meal in so you've got as much fuel in your system as you can, and then just top up within that 2 hours. So when I say top up, it might be a banana, might be a bit of sports drink, it might be a bar of some sort, it might be like anything that's small and going to give you some carbs that's going to keep you ticking along. You don't want too many really hot, what we call high GI carbs, so the really fast burning ones. And that's why we typically recommend athletes stay away from things like gels immediately, or even sports drinks to an extent, but predominantly gels immediately before you get into the race, because what it's going to do is it's going to inhibit, or it's going to accelerate the process of which you're burning through carbs, which for long endurance type stuff, it's just going to deplete your fuel stores almost before you started. It's going to sort of burn through all the fuel you were sort of waiting to use as soon as you get into the race. And that's where athletes can start to hit the wall earlier than anticipated. So you really do want to be avoiding big amounts of fuel and big amounts of low GI carbs, because what in the immediate period, like that 30-minute period, and why you're getting a stitch is mainly because of the blood flow difference. When we've got fuel that we need to be digesting, or stuff in the stomach that's needing digestion, we send all of our blood flow there because that's the priority, isn't it? It's trying to absorb those nutrients to get the fuel into the system. When we start to perform, though, we need blood flow to go to the extremity. So now we're in this dilemma where it's like, well, where do we actually want blood flow to go? Do we need it at the stomach digestive system, or do we need it at the working muscle? The body's going to want to prioritize working muscle, but because we're getting a bit at the stomach as well, and it's coming away from the stomach, we don't have as much blood flow there to actually able to process and digest as well as we possibly can. We now run into some issues in terms of that stitch sort of feeling. It can also happen when we've got way too much fluid sitting in our system as well. That's another one that athletes get a lot, is drinking too much. Body just can't absorb it well enough because the blood flow is not there to be able to help with that absorption of the fluid or of the nutrients, because the blood flow is going elsewhere. So we can start to worry about that. But yeah, I wouldn't be having big amounts of food within that sort of like definitely that half an hour window, but probably within that hour to hour and a half, I wouldn't be having big amounts of food. 2 hours, if you're doing something in the afternoon, like have lunch at sort of 12, and if your event is like 2 p.m. onwards, that's the ideal. We're sort of talking about big sort of fueling up meal a couple of hours before, and then just use your top ups to get you into the event. That's going to avoid majority of the issues. If you still have a stitch after that, maybe then you have to consider, well, what foods and what inputs were actually going through. Was it the type of food I ate? Was it the type of carbs I ate at my lunch? Was it the type of snacks that I then had? Really, there's a bit of an individual play there, but hopefully that answers your question, Sam, about when we should be fueling and how we should be fueling in that immediate part. And again, it mainly bases on race theory, what we're talking here, but it also can transfer over into some of those big training sessions throughout the week as well. And this last one here from Alan, you might have seen in the chat in previous live streams, been quite active on the channel in the comments as well. He actually jumped over onto Instagram, and I'm not sort of making this up. He sent me a message. He jumped on Instagram, had a quick look at his profile because I recognize his name. He has 0 followers. He has 0 posts. He's not following anyone else. Jumped on, sent me a message and said, I signed up to Instagram today. I'm going to follow your page. I'm new to Instagram, haven't used it before, but I've heard on one of your videos it's the best way to get in contact with you. Here's my question. Can't join the live stream. Would love you to talk through it and sort of send a reply as well. We actually had a great conversation over there, so I really appreciate him jumping across. And if you're someone like him, jump across the Instagram page if you want to get that question directly through. And if you can't make the live stream, send it through there, because it's a good way to still get it answered and get in contact with me as well. Alan's question talks about how to program in the longest run of the week. And this is something that a lot of us can sort of, I guess, have a bit of a conversation about, because it can often be that critical run of the week. If we're talking about a marathon runner, triathlete, how do we fit in that long run? Just in general, I might keep it simple and just focus on running, because I follow similar principles for triathlon. And then in his example, Alan's leading up to a marathon. So how do we go about programming it? How do we go about increasing the amount of Ks or the amount of time we're spending in that big long run in the week? How do we also adapt it as well throughout the training program? So the key principles I like to follow, if we start off with what happens in a base phase, we're just trying to build the Ks into legs, fundamentally. I always like working off time on legs rather than kilometers run, because when we focus on distance can mean a whole range of different things. You go out for a 20K run, that could be a really, really tough stimulus on the body because we're out there for a long period of time. It could also be a very, very easy stimulus on the body, or relatively easy stimulus, because we're out there just cruising along. It can be really hard because we're running a lot faster. There's so much variation depending on how you actually run that. I much prefer time on legs and then sticking to time in zone, if you like, particularly zone 2 in the base phase where we're talking about just building the aerobic conditioning or the aerobic capacity. Time on legs is going to be much more beneficial because at the end of the day, we need to train the body, and I speak about this a lot. The body doesn't have a GPS, has no idea, and coming back to some of the stuff we talked about with glycogen and fueling, body has no idea how far you've gone. It just knows how long it's been working for because it's got a fuel supply. It's like your car. If you took the odometer out of your car that measures the distance it's gone, you'd have no idea how far you've accumulated total in your car. All you know is that at some point I need to refill it to get more fuel in to be able to then go again. And if I don't refill it, then it's going to stop. That's basically really simply how the human body works as well. So when we talk about these long runs, I use time in zone, build it up slowly, aiming for by towards the middle to end of the program, we definitely want to be getting up to about, ideally in most circumstances, 100 to 110% of estimated race time or estimated split time. This isn't always the case. If you're looking at a 4-hour event, maybe you want to build up to 2.5 hours in your long run, your key long run, and then you do a supplementary run of like an hour and a half to sort of merge those together and get you the volume for the week. Can be another way of doing it. But if you're looking at something like a 3-hour marathon or you're looking at a half marathon, building up to 110% of your estimated event time is a really good starting point to give you enough time on legs. It's going to teach you to be able to run for the period of time and a little bit longer than what you actually have to do in the event. That's the first thing. Can I get from start to finish? Because if I can get from start to finish, then I can worry about how quickly I do that and what the performance outcome of it is as well. Moving into, so basically I just sort of overload that as anyone would probably overload a program, maybe increase by 5 to 10 minutes a week. That's going to increase by a couple of kilometers a week. Have a deload every couple of weeks and then reset and go again and continue to build. When I get into more that race specific phase or that build phase, whatever you like to call it, that's sort of 8 to 10 weeks out from race day, I might start to incorporate a little bit of a difference into that long run, maybe alternating week to week of 1 week is a zone 2, go out and do 2.5 hours of that long, consistent pace, build the aerobic capacity, time in zone, time on legs. The next week, I might distribute that a little bit more cleverly throughout the middle of the week. And that big focus or that big key run, maybe on the weekend for most athletes because it's most practical, is going to be some more maybe sub-threshold efforts, some tempo type running. Might do instead of 2.5 hours like you did the week before, might only do an hour 45, but a lot of that's made up of more, I guess, quality intensity. So we're maybe doing a 20-minute piece in sort of tempo and then a 10-minute recovery run and repeating that 3 or 4 times throughout the session. We might do half an hour pieces. Like these longer sustained efforts closer to race intensity is how I sneakily bring in things like tempo into the program without kind of making it a separate session and thinking it's an addition. I'm just changing and substituting it. Then coming back the next week, so I've gone 2.5 hours zone 2. I've actually come down in total amount of volume covered or amount of time covered, but the intensity's gone up, so my loading's quite comparable, and it gets that race specificity in the legs and how long you can run at slightly higher intensity, which is going to be more specific as well. Get into that third week, and I go back to the zone 2 stuff and bring that back in, and I go up to maybe 2 hours 45, so start to stretch the volume a bit, and then I have my deload. In that middle week, something I do want to add here, in that middle week where we are doing something different with that long run, it's not just zone 2, because we're talking about race specific now, I do change up the middle of the normal stuff in the week, so I don't do as much, I guess, fatiguing work in terms of long interval, like not too much in terms of like threshold-based interval. Try to reduce the volume there because I'm getting more higher intensity volume on the weekend. Just a little side note on that, so you're not going and overcooking yourself, but it is the side of things that fitting in that long run is really critical. So building it just time on legs in the base phase is critical. You could also carry that across to the race specific. I've done that with athletes before and it's been quite effective. I think it is really a case by case scenario of what are the athletes' needs. And I typically would get that from things like testing, having a look at previous race results. All right, what are some of the issues? You really blew up at the hour and a half mark, and your half marathon was an hour 45. Let's practice running for an hour 45 at a long slow, so at least we know we can get to the end and we can run for that period of time total. Now let's work on how we can do that faster, and that's what that race specific phase does. Mind over body, how far should this be taken into consideration? 1, completing 5K after a semi-rolled ankle, running halfway. So I'm assuming you rolled your ankle partway through the run. Let me know if I'm correct there. And 2, speed sessions while having lactic acid cramps. In terms of that first part, having a semi-rolled ankle, how much is it? Should we stop and actually consider the injury, and how much should we keep pushing ourselves? I would be saying we should be initially cautious, and you're always going to be. You're going to feel the pain initially of rolling your ankle, and it's never fun. Everyone's probably done it a handful of times, and some worse than others. Obviously, if it's at a point where you've clearly done some structural damage, rolling the ankle can vary from a slight inward turn and it's like, oh, that was a bit painful, all the way up to you've done ligament damage and you're probably not actually going to be able to walk on that foot. That's where I think it's really clear to make the distinction of should you push through and it's mind over body. Should I just keep going, or should I back it off or even potentially stop? I always err on the side of you're better off thinking about the long-term side effect of, if I push through here, is this going to do me long-term damage? And what is that going to do for further events, further training, further races? You hear stories all the time of athletes, they're in their last race before they retire or things like that, and they just push through. Do I recommend it? Not necessarily, because then there's also health side effects as well. Like if you rolled your ankle bad enough and you do some significant ligament damage, then that could mean physical activity in general becomes really, really difficult for you if it never really heals back to where it is long term, let alone racing and competing. It's then long term after that we can be still, I guess, feeling the impacts of it. So I look at it from that perspective. If it's just a minor sort of sprain and things like that, and you kind of run it out or walk it out and you're good to go, it's probably not going to be damaging long term. But if it's the type of thing that you can't even weight bear on it, then there's no point trying to just grit it out and push through, because you're going to do more damage long term to your own health and well-being. And that's the last thing that I would sort of recommend going into. And I'm sure a lot of medical professionals and physios and things like that would also not recommend pushing on past the point of where it's necessary. And going into races injured as well is always something that I advocate against. There's like, what's the point if you're going in injured, you're going in with a negative mindset already? If you're not going to be able to race as best you can, is it better just to pull the pin and move forward and rehab the injury and get back and be as strong as what you possibly can? I would argue. Yes. So that's it for this week. That were some of the best questions, or my favorite ones that came out of the stream anyway. Let me know your thoughts down below as always. Make sure you do hit that subscribe button and keep supporting the channel. Go check out Instagram as well. Like I said at the beginning, and I said partway through the video as well on stream, head over to Instagram. If you can't make the lives, that's the best place to get directly in contact with me, ask your questions. I'm always going to get a notification when you send a direct message on Instagram. Ask them over there and I can bring them onto live stream or get back to you straight away with a response, a little bit quicker way to do it. But I really love you to jump on, join the conversation live and continue to help us grow this great community we got growing on over here. So otherwise, that is it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed the stream highlights for this week and looking forward to seeing you on the stream next week. We'll see you in the next one.